You good? Go ahead and start. All right, cool. All right. I hope you had a good lunch. I had a delicious wrap from downstairs. So if your talk comes up unexpectedly, always know that you can get a wrap downstairs. My name's Mark Allen. I'm going to talk to you today about building web service clients in Perl using roles. How many of you already do this as part of your normal day-to-day Perl usage? Yeah, a few so-so people. How many of you use roles regularly as part of your programming discipline? How many of you like to use like inheritance properties? Okay. All right, so I have a purpose today, which is to convert you to thinking roles are a better way to do things. So let me know after the talk if I've achieved my goal. Great. So the kind of web services that I'm talking about are typically ones that are made available by companies that are providing services out on the internet. So think of blank as a service, such as IRC trolling as a service, or I don't know, cat pictures as a service, stuff like that. That's the kind of web service clients that I'm talking about in this particular talk. Now, if you have internal APIs in your company or whatever that aren't exposed to the internet, that do things like I don't know, customer provisioning as a service, or accounting as a service, or bookkeeping as a service, or whatever. I think these techniques are also great for those too. But obviously, you guys know more about your environment than me. So, take this with a grain of salt. This is a good technique, I think, in general. But of course, with Perl, there's more than one way to do it. And the corollary with that is some ways are better than others. Also applies equally. So I seriously don't know what's going on in the next room, but it sounds like they're having a lot of fun over there. I don't know if my talk is going to be as entertaining as theirs, but I'll do my best for you. So yeah, that actually one of the things that was really fun at OSCON was Pier's colleague got up and he convinced people in the Perl track to always like cheer really loudly, so that all the other people in all the other rooms were wondering what the hell was going on. And that was a lot of fun. So maybe we can do that at the end of the talk. And I'm a little self-interested in that, so I admit that that would be nice for me too. But it was actually a lot of fun to just make noise randomly because of Perl. I have struggled since I started giving talks 4 or 5 years ago to shy away from writing lots of text and verbiage. And so you guys are going to be part of an experiment today, unwillingly and unwittingly. I'm going to try to communicate more visually and see how that goes. And so some of these pictures are tangentially related. They are maybe not directly related to Perl or coding. They're just pretty pictures that I like. And some of them hopefully are funny. Actually, I don't think I have any cat pictures. So if you're expecting cat pictures, sorry, you will be disappointed. But I do have some other pictures that I hope that you like. So if you are interested in writing web service clients, and I assume that you are because you're in this talk, you should probably also know that there's a mailing list that's been set up on Perl Hacks that is focused on developing web service clients. And again, these are blank as a service type offerings that are available on the internet. Most service providers these days tend not to write client libraries for any language or only for a few select languages like PHP, Node.js, whatever the new hotness is. So one of the things that we decided to do as a community was to set up this mailing list, and I just want to let you know that it's out there and available. So on that mailing list, there was a traffic in April, I think, probably about the time I was thinking about what I should talk about at YAPC. And it was, what are some patterns and what are some good techniques and tips to build web service clients in Perl? And I've written a bunch of them, so I wrote a pretty long post, and then I decided, well, I'm going to try to develop that into a talk. So that's what this talk is. That's where this talk came from. That's the genesis of them. Like I said before, there's always more than one way to do it in Perl. So this is what works for me, and again, I think these are good ways to do them. There are also lots of other ways to build Perl clients too. Some of them is equally valid, and I'll get into some of those things towards the talk, middle part of the talk. So a couple of things that I like about building Perl web service clients is that, most of the time authors try to build libraries in Perl that are helpful. So they have this property where you don't really have to think about them too much. They have good defaults, hopefully, and they just sort of do what you mean. You don't have to really coerce them into doing things, but they also don't hide methods of coercion. And they also don't have a lot of ceremony, so you don't have to like pre-declare a whole bunch of stuff. You can just kind of get to work right away and get going with your API. I think that things that have a lot of ceremony tend to be not a good design pattern. So things that require a lot of initialization or require a ton of configuration on the part of someone who's building on top of a client library is probably not a good design pattern. So as an author of a web service client, I would suggest that you put good defaults into that web service client so that people that are using it can get started right away. There's not a lot of configuration that they have to do for themselves. Try to do some of the thinking for the people that consume the library before they consume it. So we had a couple of people are using patterns of inheritance, and I think inheritance is great for certain very small cases. For example, if you have a library that imports things into someone's namespace, right? Like maybe you want to derive from exporter so you don't have to write your own import. If you're using something like Moose or Moo, then you pretty much already get all the import that you need. So in that particular case, just using Moo, just consuming the library, the top level object system library is going to provide what you need for inheritance. So why not inheritance? I said at the beginning of the talk that I think inheritance is a great pattern, but I think specifically for web service clients, it's not a great pattern. And the reasons are, the biggest one that I can think of is that there's an action at a distance potential problem here. Perl's not especially good at doing inheritance. It allows multiple inheritance, and the things that you inherit from are actually not as reusable as you might think them to be. So the reason I say that is because if you have a very large superclass, it moves all of the initialization logic and code into a different class, and so that means that if you derive something from a superclass, a parent class, the person that is implementing your stuff is going to have to understand all of it in order to debug it. And also, you have to trace that parent all the way through your code. So you can't just take out specific segments of functionality and encapsulate them into a reusable part. It's an all or nothing proposition. You either inherit all of the parent class or you inherit none of the parent class. And so my proposition to you is that something that's a little less coupled is actually a better way to design things. And in the case of web service clients, really what you're focusing on is serialization format and some kind of web user agent. So you want some sort of library that's going to communicate with the web service, and you need some way to package and format the request data. Whether or not that comes from post parameters that's URL encoded, or JSON, or it's XML. Hopefully not XML, but I guess it could be XML. So you're looking at a serialization library and a web request library, and I'm going to talk about some of the suggestions I have for things that you might want to consider when you're building or selecting those libraries too. So let's talk about roles. There are a lot of different libraries on CPAN that actually implement roles, and maybe some of you use them already. I asked up front how many people use things like Moose and Moo, and it seemed like a pretty sizable portion of the audience did that. There's also a couple of other libraries that you might want to consider using in case you don't want any part of the Moo system. Like, for example, you have some sort of business reason why you don't want to put Moo or Moose into your code base. There's libraries that are available like Role Basic, which Ovid wrote, and that is a very, very simple role implementation, and it really only exports a couple of functions. It's very straightforward and easy to use. And there's another one that's part of Moo that's called Role Tiny, Role tiny is actually the base class for moo_role, and I'm going to talk about moo_role in depth in a little bit once I actually get to the code slides that I reluctantly put into this talk. Role tiny is available, and role basics available, moose is available, moo is available. All of these things build roles. And if you're wondering what exactly is a role, think of a role as a piece of functionality that implements an action verb. So for example, it's something that an object does. So if an object can be serialized, then you might have a role called serializable or serializer. And if you have if an object can be sent over the network, you might have a role called request or requester. And if you have an object that can be sent to disk, you might have something that saves it into a disk format, like using serial or storable. And you might call those storable or something like that. So those are the things that roles would encapsulate. All right. When I came up with this talk, and when I put a lot of web services on CPAN, sometimes I get pull requests to change. I always so let me back up. I tend to target Perl 5.14 as the base Perl for my web service clients, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit here in this slide with the onion. 5.14 was the first release that ships with HTTP Tiny and JSONPP in core. And so for that reason, it covers the two biggest things that you need to build a web service client for most web services. It has a serializer that's already available, and it already has an HTTP client that's already available. Since they ship with core, you're kind of like 60 to 70% of the way there. You might want to add in moo or some other object system for a little syntactic sugar to define attributes and methods and things like that, just to make your code look clean and modern, whatever that means. And so I would strongly recommend that you orient your code towards using those modules, and that you also target Perl 5.14 as a baseline. So the story I was starting with is that once I put code up on CPAN and also on GitHub, sometimes I'll get pull requests from people that want to back off the base version of Perl. They want me to include a patch that essentially makes the library target Perl 5.8 or something that's equally old. And I have generally, I appreciate the sentiment behind that, but what I'm trying to do is to make this focused on the most recent baseline of Perl that I can, and be true to the idea that I have for that module, which is I want this to run on a reasonably modern Perl that has all the dependencies or most of the dependencies in core, that I don't have to go out and download 50,000 things from CPAN in order for this stuff to build and for it to test and so forth. So I've generally held off on approving those kinds of pull requests, and I have occasionally accepted those pull requests, but in general I try not to do that. But 5.14 is a really great Perl release, and of course all this stuff is still in current Perl 5.20, and things are just getting better and faster with every release. All right. So while I was building this talk, one of the things that I tried to think about was, well, if we're using JSONPP as a serializer, most people use JSONXS as their serializer, which of course is written in C. And I wondered, well, how much faster is JSONXS compared to JSONPP? And to do that comparison, you need to have some sort of data structure to serialize. So what I really needed to have was a library that builds a random data structure. And what I found on CPAN was there was no library to do that, much to my surprise. And so I decided I would go ahead and write one. What I found is that JSONXS is roughly 20 to 30 times faster than JSONPP. But the thing that's important to know here is that JSONPP, depending on the hash structure, still encodes 4,000 to 12,000 data structures a second. So for 90% of the cases that you're going to encounter, JSONPP will not be the bottleneck in your library. It's going to be the speed of the network. It's going to be latency between the client computer and the server. It's going to be internet. It's going to be a backhoe. It's going to be something like that that's going to make your library, quote, slow, unquote. And so one of the things that I've felt more comfortable with is using JSONPP actually as the serialization library for web service clients. It doesn't require C, it doesn't require a compiler on the place where it's installed at, and in general is going to be fast enough. So it's not the fastest, obviously, but it's fast enough. And speaking of shaving yaks, I uploaded the library that I wrote to create random data structures to CPAN. So if you want, it's available. It's called data random structure, and you can use it if you want in your own code and to test with. So the web service that I wanted to talk about specifically today is a web service that I wrote, 6 months ago maybe, for a service called Geocodio, which does geocoding. And it does geocoding ridiculously cheaply. And in fact, it charges 0.001 cent per lookup, and you get 2,500 a month for free. The reason it's so cheap is because the data source they're using comes from the US Census. And it's not as accurate as like MaxMind's database. For some people that's okay though. Like for some people, not having the level of accuracy that MaxMind gives you is fine. And the price is right, which is to say, for most applications, it's going to be free, as long as you don't need the sort of pinpoint accuracy that I say a more mature service would provide. So they had a client out of the gate that was written in PHP because this entire service is implemented in PHP, and the guys, the husband and wife that run this company, implemented the whole thing in PHP. So they're PHP enthusiasts and coders and stuff. And so from the community of different programmers, they came up with a Node.js client, a Python client, a Ruby client, and a Clojure client, and a whole bunch of other languages. And so I decided, well, I was going to write one for Perl because I like geocoding and I'm interested in geocoding, and I just wanted it seemed like they had a really nice API. So I wrote this library called Web Service Geocodio. Just as an aside, I've started putting all of my Perl web services into the web service space on CPAN. I've noticed that more and more of web service authors are starting to collect things in there instead of, say, net, which is getting very, very overpopulated. I have occasionally used net too, but I'm trying to use web service now for all of my new libraries. And so I would also encourage you to use web service for yours and join the community that's growing around that namespace. So I just hacked out the first thing in a couple hours. I would say the first try was definitely a minimum viable library. It really only supported forward name lookups, which is to say you could give it an address, which is a street address and a city and a zip code and a state, and it would give you back a latitude and longitude pair. And that's the only service they offered. And I would say that the first attempt at writing this code was not great. So it worked, but the code structure was not where I was super happy with it. And it was good enough, basically. So about a month later or 6 weeks later, so I got an email from them because I'd been coordinating and said, hey, I wrote a Perl client for this and I'm going to put it on CPAN, and I uploaded it to GitHub. And so they sent me an email about a week before they were going to release this new feature, which was reverse geocoding. That's where you give a latitude and longitude and you get back a street address. So I got this email, and I was very sad about it. And basically, I had to tear apart my entire library and just start over again. So I was kind of stuck with this big mess of code, and I wasn't very happy with it. One of the things that I did that was wrong to start with was I broke encapsulation. So I had a lot of messy stuff everywhere. I was serializing things all over the place. I was deserializing them all over the place. I wasn't actually handling the objects, sort of respectfully, I guess is the way I would put it. And like I said, the code worked, right? As a consumer of the code, maybe you wouldn't care so much about its implementation. But just as someone that appreciates nice, clean code, I wasn't very happy with it. And so I actually essentially left the top level API was the same, but all of the internal guts of it pretty much got sledgehammered. And so we rebuilt the library into a new form that was a little bit nicer, a little bit more elegant. It's still not super pretty, right? It's not like you're going to find it in a magazine or anything, but I'm certainly a lot happier with the code. And so what I discovered was, when you think carefully about how you want to implement your objects and your roles, it leads you to some design patterns. And that's what I wrote my post about, because I had just finished doing all of this refactoring work and supporting extra fields. And I'm going to talk about some of those things in a minute. The first thing I wanted to show you was, this is the start of the text slides, sorry. Is just sort of a random request role. And so here I'm using moo role. There's a couple of things I want to suggest and point out to you. The first is that moo specifically fatalizes warnings. I think that's fine, I guess, as a choice. I don't necessarily agree with the fact that it's a default. But the thing is that if you include or use moo role in your web service client, then you are fatalizing warnings for your consumers. So if someone builds code on top of this library and you don't include use warnings non-fatal all, then what's going to happen is as soon as they get a warning in their code, then it's all going to die. And unless you set expectations that that's the behavior that you're giving them, that's probably not a very nice thing to do. So I strongly recommend that you defatalize warnings, and the way you do that is right there. I'm also, as you can see, using HTTP Tiny. Another design pattern that I personally like to use is I use confess to throw errors. So whenever I have exceptions or problems with my libraries, I use confess to throw an exception. And I tell the people that consume it that if they want something that's more graceful, they can use try tiny, which is a great solution for capturing fatal errors and recovering from them in some way that's better than just dumping a stack trace and dying. There's a couple of things also here that I think are important. I have a couple of attributes that I also suggest that you look at or work with. One is a user agent, and I made it lazy, which is pretty awesome. That defers all the cost of initialization until you actually need to send a request. And that could be a nice startup speed optimization for people that consume your library. And I also have a base URL attribute. So this is a nice way to centralize what service URL you're going to use for your web service client. So for example, in this particular example, I have api.foobar.io because .io is the new hotness. But I have had some APIs change from, there was one API in particular that I'm thinking of for EasyPost, which is a postage service where you give it dimensions and all sorts of stuff, and it will go ahead and create postage labels for you to use for shipping services. They started out their service with easypost.co, and then eventually they acquired the easypost.com domain name, and then they switched all of their service URLs to .com. And because I had centralized all of the places in my code with this one URL, is just that one update, and and then I just do a new CPAN release, and it's good to go. So I think that's a really good pattern too. One other thing I wanted to show off in the particular request object is this underscore request method. In this particular case, I'm telling you ideally the data is already serialized, but here's the exception that proves a rule. Sometimes you're not going to have a scalar, right? You're not, or a ref. Like typically that would be a hash ref or something. Typically, it's going to be a ref, or it's going to be a hash or a string or something that's ready to send on the wire. With the geocodio library, I didn't do this pattern, and the reason I didn't do that was because I have a location object as part of the package. So you can say web service geocodio location, and then you can give it a street address and a zip code, and it will go ahead and do its best to query based on the information that you provide to it. But I also allow you to just send in a bare string. So you could put in like a zip code, like 10017, and just use that as your geolocation entry. And because I allow that for the consumers, I couldn't go ahead and serialize my data before it hit the request thing here. So I have some logic in the geocodio library that is a little bit less clean than this. But in general, I think this is a good pattern, and this is one that I try to follow when I can. So I have a URL builder that takes an operation. That's what the $op is. So for example, this might be, I don't know, update user account, or create foo or something. And so that's what that is, and that's usually part of the URL component, right? You're making a call into it. Typically, it's going to be a post. So then we make our request through our UA attribute, which HTTP Tiny has a request method, and it takes 3 parameters, which is to say it takes the verb and it takes the location, so whatever that is, and then it takes a hash ref. And the hash ref has to contain content, so this is what you're going to post. And it contains other things too. For example, you can add new headers here and other things like that. Oh, I just remembered. One other thing that I like to do on the user agent side of things, and I forgot to mention this earlier, but I'll mention it now, is I like to set default headers for content type. For example, if I'm using a JSON service, I'll always make sure that I set content type to JSON, so that's what I'm setting. Some services are super finicky about what format you get back. Sometimes you need to set an accept header, which tells the server what type of content you will accept in return. And so, for example, you might want to set a pair of these. So you have content type application JSON because you are sending application JSON, and you might have a header that says accept application JSON because you want application JSON to return to you. If you had something that was XML, you could change it to be application XML, et cetera, et cetera. And the other thing I like to do is have the user agent up here defined right there in one location. In HTTP Tiny specifically, if you put a space between the end of the string that you have here and the end of the single quote, then HTTP Tiny will automatically append its current version string to the library call. So when you send the request out, it will actually have the user agent string be that string plus the HTTP Tiny version. And I think that's super useful for people that are upstream of you. It's just a polite way to say, hey, this is a Perl web client, and here's the current version, and this is what we're doing, and we're hitting your service. So that's a way for them to just keep track of how popular their various client libraries are. So it's a nice way to let people that are running services know that you're using their service with a particular web service client. Right, so I mentioned earlier I like to do confesses when I fail. So let's say that op is like a if then else type data structure. You get back the URL as a string, and if you don't get one, you say you couldn't build it, and confess that. And then down here, if the result is a success, then you go ahead and you just return the result. So the result comes back as a hash ref. Typically, it's going to have some sort of JSON string in it as its content. And then if you don't get that, if you get some other error code or something, then you can just go ahead and output what that is. So status and content, show you what the error is, tell you where the error happened from the caller's perspective, which is nice for the people that build on your library. If you don't use confess, then it's just going to say I died at whatever line 24 in module X, which is fine, but it's not a great error message because it doesn't really help them very much. All right. So I have another role here. Again, non-fatalizing, using non-fatal. I'm using JSON, which is a nice switch here. I could have put JSONPP, but I think the normal usage pattern is to use the JSON module, which picks between which one you have. Again, using carp confess. In this case, I'm not actually confessing anything because I don't have any exceptions here. But this is a really simple pattern that you could use to implement JSON serializer or deserializer. And then finally, I have this slide where I'm sort of showing a data object. So this would be the way that you consume the roles. So for example, in my data object, I'm saying this is something that I can serialize using JSON. So I'm going to go ahead and include the role here, and that's the with keyword right here, with string of this class. It's actually not a class though, so I probably shouldn't say that. But in any case, down here I have a method called _serialize. So I'm making the data object responsible for serialization. Anytime that we want to go ahead and send this over the wire, we're going to go ahead and call this _serialize to actually create the data object that we want to send to the downstream service. Are there any questions at this point before I go on to talk about testing? Any questions? Okay, let's talk about testing. I think testing is something that is often overlooked in web service clients. And it makes me sad. I don't quite understand why. I'm going to go through a couple of slides that talk about some best practices with testing that I try to follow when I can. Notice I say when I can. So it's not all the time that you need to do every single thing. But in general, I would say that if you're writing web service clients, a good way for you to be confident that you're providing the service that people can consume with some level of I don't know what the right word is, assurance, I guess. Some level of assurance that it's actually going to do what you claim it does is to go ahead and write tests. And those can take the form of unit tests. So one of the things that I like to do in unit testing is test the things that don't require internet access, or don't require credentials, or don't require external fixtures in order to execute the test. These would be things like data objects. So for example, if I have a getter and a setter for an attribute, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that if there's business logic inside of that, like if I have triggers or default values, or if I have builders, right, on certain attributes and stuff like that in Moo or Moose, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that those things actually execute in the way that I expect. So I'm going to make all of those unit tests, and I'm going to set those up separately, apart from things that need more fixtures. What I've found is that I actually catch a lot of bugs that way by testing all the things that don't need internet access in their own test. And that way I'm not tripped up by the fact that I needed network access and I have crappy hotel Wi-Fi when I'm doing my unit tests, and they might time out or whatever. So those things, you want to try to isolate the test failure cause, separately from the actual code that you're testing. If you have a fixture that fails to set up, that's a different kind of failure than if your code has just got a bug in it or something. So unit tests are good. Unit tests separate from internet access and other things is also awesome. So you're writing web service. You 99% of the time are going to need to have internet access to execute functional tests. And make sure that you test whether or not you can connect to the internet before you actually execute tests that require the internet. I have been bitten by this in the past when, for example, I fail or forget to put in a test for network access and then upload something to CPAN, and then the next day I come back and I get a CPAN's report that says, my test failed 97 times on every platform, and I'm like, what? It worked on my machine. So what I would strongly suggest is that you include tests to make sure that you can test the network. And if the network is not available, then you go ahead and skip the test. I know it seems common sense, but again, this is trying to collect some design patterns and best practices. So I have forgotten to do this in the past, and it's been irritating. So just a friendly reminder. So funny story, this talk was supposed to be tomorrow, and I have been feverishly working on a test called Test Requires Internet. And what it does is it lets you say something like use test requires internet, and then you can give it a list of host names and port numbers. And it will go ahead and check all those, and if they're all available, then it will return thumbs up. And if they're not available, then it will say not available, and it will skip your test. But because I had to give the talk today, I didn't get to finish that, so it's not on CPAN yet. But hopefully it will be on CPAN by the end of this week. So keep your eyes peeled for that. But in the interim, what I can tell you to do is core Perl contains socket. So socket is a cheap and easy way for you to create a socket to an arbitrary port number. And if you look at the test for web service geocodio, you will actually see this repeated in 4 different test files. The idea is that you open a socket to the host name that you care about and the port number that you care about. So if you're doing HTTPS tests, you'd hit 443. If you're doing HTTP tests, you'd hit port 80. If you're doing telnet tests, you'd hit port 23 or whatever. And just make sure you can open that socket. If you get an error back from the socket API, then you know that you can't use the internet. So go ahead and skip tests. That's a cheap and easy way to do that. Like I said, hopefully that will be encapsulated in a test, in a test module pretty soon, so that you don't have to worry about that yourself. Yeah. So next slide. So one of the other things that you're probably going to need for cat pictures as a service is some sort of API credential. And this is ubiquitous now. You need a username and password combination, which you send along in basic authorization over HTTPS, or you need to do some kind of crazy hash signing thing like with Amazon Web Services, or you need to do some kind of token basically that says, hey, I'm developer X and I'm using this client and I need to access your API, please. This is what I want to do. And what I've found is writing tests that need credentials is also somewhat problematic. For example, like you don't want to include your personal credentials in a test file that gets uploaded on CPAN. That seems like that would not be a good idea. So what I have found is that some service providers are actually really helpful. If you email them and say, hey, I'm writing this Perl web client for your service. I really like your service. Do you have a test credential that I can embed in a test file? Sometimes they'll say yes, or sometimes they will make you one and send you one. And those credentials can be used to execute functional tests, and they're limited in such a way that people that want to reuse them would be prohibited from doing so unless they were actually executing tests. Sometimes those require alternate URLs and so forth. But the moral of the story is that if you need a test credential, ask for a test credential. 90% of the time, at least in my experience, people have been super helpful with getting their API a client in Perl. Maybe they're not Perl gurus themselves or whatever, but they are interested in having Perl clients. So they will do what they can to help you within reason, right? So if you're doing crazy things with their service or causing problems or whatever, then they'll probably tell you to stop. But if you need help or you want can you give me 100 requests a month for free or something like that? People are really open to doing that. So give it a shot. The worst they can do is say no. And if they say no, then just use your own personal credential. This is what I usually do, and I pull it from the environment. So one of the things I'll do when the test starts is look for an environment key like service underscore API key, and if that's in the environment, right? So you just do export blah blah blah, and then you put in your key. If that's available in the environment when it's executing, it'll go ahead and execute the test. And if it's not, then it won't execute the test. It'll skip it. Are there any questions about that? Again, this is one of the things I wanted to wrap up into a CPAN module. Haven't quite gotten around to it yet, but I am interested in writing it, and so hopefully we'll find some to-its to get around to doing it sooner or later. So hopefully sooner rather than later. But again, if you check the environment for a key that you decide on, and if it's available, use it. If it's not, skip it. That's another great way to write functional tests that are that fail gracefully in environments where those aren't available, for like on CPAN testers and stuff like that. Finally, if you're writing a synopsis in your documentation, the pod code or the pod that you put with your module, most Perl modules have synopsis that kind of have an overview, I guess, of the main functions. If you're writing Perl code in that, then please make that a functional test of your code. Take your code, hopefully verbatim, write out the pod, put it into a unit test, and again, check if internet's available, check if there's an API key that's available, and execute it. Make sure that people that consume your library can actually just cut and paste that with the appropriate API key and execute it right away. That's going to be a great way for people to feel confident that your code works, that it does what it says it does, and that it's actually up to date and reasonably in spec with the current API. So that's another thing that I've learned kind of the hard way. People actually do cut and paste your synopsis and test it. And if it doesn't work, then you're going to find out about it. So my suggestion is that you test it before you release, and then you won't have to worry about it at all. I also have this fantastic slide here from Dwight, which is, before I do anything, I ask, would an idiot do that? And then if the answer is yes, don't do that thing. So it's encouraging you to think about how you want to make all of your objects interact, hopefully in a way that's more sophisticated than just getting it done as quickly as you can. And if you have to blow it up and start over again, that's fine. That's why you have APIs, right? Like, you can keep the outer API and you can blow up the interior, hopefully, and no one's going to know. No one's going to be the wiser that you've changed all this stuff on the inside of it. Those are the things that I find have really helped me build good, robust Perl web clients. Are there any questions? Yeah.
There was a question, but the network thing, there's a module in net detect that does that.
Okay.
And also for the synopsis, there's also a test module that will take your synopsis and make it into a test.
Okay.
So you don't even have to copy and paste the test. It'll just include that in your directory.
Okay.
The name of it up.
Okay. Just for the people playing along at home, there was a suggestion to use a module called net detect to test whether or not network is available. And then there's also a suggestion that there's a test module that will automatically extract and execute your synopsis code as a functional test, which is very cool. And I did not know that. So yeah. Are there any other questions or comments? Yeah.
There's a module that's name I'm working on right now. I think it's called like REST client or something like that.
Yeah.
Role REST client. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you use that?
Yeah, so I know that there's a bunch of sort of REST construction kits, and I have used one of them. It's called Net API. Actually, I think it's Net API HTTP. It's built on top of Moose. Yeah, it's built on top of Moose. And I did use it to build one web service client. And it was nice, but I felt like it had a really heavy cognitive load. And what I mean by that was, it was hard for me to fully reason about the way that it did things. There was almost too much magic there for me to fully comprehend how it worked. And even though I had good test coverage and things, and I felt confident that the implementation that I built on top of it was fine, it turned out to be really difficult for me to get my head wrapped around it completely. The role REST client thing I have not used, but it does sound promising. And it's certainly in line with the kind of things that I'm advocating here. I typically tend to do exactly what I just described in this talk, which is to say I will build a request role and I will build a serializer role, and then I will use those with custom data objects for the particular thing that I'm trying to build a service for, and roll that into one distribution. I don't know if it's just me personally, like, I'm not the world's smartest person, so I'm just trying to do what's right for me, and gives me confidence that I'm solving the problem. So, are there any other questions or comments? No. All right. Well, thank you very much for your attention today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about this. If you have any questions, I'll be around till all day. So yeah, just come and find me, and we'll rap about it. Thank you. I'm